The night before the decree was spoken, Missandei listened to the great pyramid breathe. Up in its raw, high quiet, the stone gathered the city's perspiration and gave it back as a whispering dampness along the corridors. Braziers smoldered with the bitter perfume of Giscari resin. The moon was a worn coin, thin and stubborn, skimming behind low cloud. She had claimed a small alcove near the eastern terrace, where a slit of air showed Marine as a broken comb of rooftops and domes, and where a cumbersome cedar table could rest against the wall without listing to the age of the floor. On the table, she had her inks and 3 lamps with parched silk shades, and beside them rolled maps whose edges remembered other climates. She had been copying, yet again, the names of the sea's wines in a dozen tongues, so that their equivalences would be within reach of the hand, not only of the mind. Engalu, of Nath, warm and smelling of papaya groves and skin, though she had been a child when she breathed at last. Nokaro in Kohor, a harder word with the hammered ring that blacksmiths use for prayers. The Bravosi called it Squin, ugly in the mouth and beautiful in the lungs. She wrote each, almost chanting, and beneath them added the tiny notes people imagine do not matter. Squin turns treacherous when the day is overwritten by cloud. Sailors of Tyrosh do not name it aloud. In Pentashi it is invoked to move trade that would otherwise turn to rancor. She paused when the lower city rumbled, a heaviness that ran under the skin of the stone. The sound did not belong to riot or to drums. It was the simple bulk of thousands of bodies shifting their dreams at once. A cough burst in some alley and echoed thinly. Far off, a night fisher shouted to the shore, and his shout came up on the dark air as if punched through a horn. Missandei laid her brush aside and flexed the fingers that grew cramped when she forced them to keep elegant letters in an inelegant hour. She had not slept well since the harpy's last shadow fell from the roof footings. Sleep wanted birdsong and the feet of children stamping dust into the courtyards of Enath. Marine gave her boiling oil and secret stares, and the eyes of men who loved a queen, only when she made a whole people kneel. She had learned not to fear the eyes, to speak into them with a linen voice that never frayed, to wring their respect from them with perfect grammar. But it was work, and even her stillness grew tired. She heard the dragon's smaller breath before the soft, purposeful footfall of the man. The lesser breath came like leather turning in a trunk. The footfall came as if it wished to erase itself even as it landed. She did not turn. She felt the nearness and found a smile waiting quietly for it, as if it had been folded near her lips all night. "Commander," she said. Grey Worm did not always know what to do with being named, but he had learned to accept it like water in a basin. He came to stand within the small semicircle where lamplight did not flicker, carpeted in shadow. He wore the sleeved black that was his concession to the hour, and the Queen's policy of looking less like a blade in dim rooms. His helmet he would not bring unless she asked for soldiers, which she had not. She could feel him looking past her to the slit of air as if he had rehearsed the exact angle to be certain of what she had been thinking. "Your lamps are low," he said. "They are low," she agreed, and took the wick trimmer. Too much light makes ideas skittish. He absorbed that, nodding once. She knew he carried away such phrases to turn them over like stones until he recognized the insects beneath. Grey Worm looked down at her brushes, at the map prints of tides whose margins were a lace of her own notes, and then at the small bowl of water in which floated, improbably, a section of shell, pearly and ridged. He had seen the shell before. He never asked about it. "The Queen asks for you," he said. Missandei set the trimmer aside. A warm creeping traveled under the bones of her hands. She wiped her nibs with the sewn rag she had folded precisely for that purpose and rose, smoothing her skirt in a gesture that had not been taught her, not here and not by the unsullied, who did not fidget. She was still sometimes surprised to find the body was hers. It had been owned in other states. The thought never failed to come when she was summoned, and she allowed it to come, so that when it finished, it could go and leave her plain. "No," she said, though she knew the answer. Grey Worm's mouth softened a fraction and made a line that lived between obedience and something he brought to no other face. "Now," he said. They walked together down hallways that had outlived 6 languages and used all of them in their stone. Missandei measured the distance in breaths and turns. 7 corners, 2 open balconies, one side passage that carried stew meat and mint, a stair broader than a ship's deck, the place where the orrery of a dead scholar lay covered as if the dust were expensive cloth. Silent women knelt with coals in their hands and bowed without looking up. An old man whose hair had gone gray in the shape of the harpy's wings around his face passed them with a scroll against his chest. He veered away as if a tide had turned toward him. When the door to the queen's chamber came, the two unsullied outside did not knock. They gave the small nod that meant the eyes within had seen them before they wished to be seen. Grey Worm let Missandei pass him. She felt his nearness fall away, as one feels a warm wall leave the back. Daenerys Targaryen was unbound, which was to say her hair was wet and untamed, and the robe she wore was a dark, sleeping thing. She sat on the floor, back to a pillar, the striped rug of Korth beneath her bare feet. The lamps were simple. The only ostentation was rolled against the foot of the bed, a great carpet of green that held within its dyes the whole of some unknown garden, its fruit, its snakes, its birds, its clear water, made with a woven shimmer so cunning the mind made a sound for it. The queen looked up. Missandei's throat went dry as it sometimes did when she saw the person and the symbol share a single pair of eyes. If Missandei could have drawn the sound her queen made when she exhaled after thinking too long, she would have drawn a thin blue line, wavering only at the end, like a thread stolen from the border of the sky. "Missandei," Daenerys said, saying the vowels as she had been taught by the girl herself, soft and true. "Sit." She sat, not beside but at a respectful angle, so that they could share the room without competing with the pillar. Daenerys watched the small flame in the bronze lamp, and then she watched Missandei watch the flame. When she smiled, it began with the corner of her mouth that had learned to smile in places where smiling was not a prize. "I have been held by men," Daenerys said, speaking gently so the jar did not break as it was handed. "By a city, by the old laws that wear the faces of elders like a murder that returns to the scene. I have let them hold me to learn the shape of their hands. I am done. To begin again, I must say a thing that will not be understood." "You have said many such things," said Missandei, and the corner of the queen's mouth changed. "Tyrion is clever," Daenerys said. "He is a mind that rolls itself in wine and still finds purchase. He has been hand to one who wore a crown from a throne of knives and did not perish of it. He can teach me the dangerous games. I am grateful. I am not certain that is the hand I need for the world I wish to feel." Missandei bowed her head for the half-heartbeat it took to gather the fullness of those words and set them where they would be steady. She did not speak. "I want a hand," Daenerys said, "who hears the language of the world beneath the language of men. I want a hand who keeps the meaning whole as it crosses a river. I want a hand who remembers Neath when trade speaks, and Meereen when Neath does, and who knows that a word for breath can also be a word for law in some places, and that it might be better for our laws to breathe." "Dinde." Missandei felt the breath in her chest turn to an instrument. She closed her eyes. The lamps warmed her lids. She let the words pass over her like water over warm stone, feeling where they caught. "Your Grace," she said, and the old formality made her voice deeper. "I am a poor woman who survived by saying what others needed to hear, in the manner they needed to hear it, so that I could remain in the world long enough to learn its grammar. I can give you that, but a hand also must carry a sword. But a hand also must carry a sword. A hand must know where not to swing it," Daenerys said simply. Missandei's eyes opened. The queen's face had gone quiet. That stillness she held like a sword's long shadow. The robe had slipped at the shoulder. She did not correct it. Missandei saw, as she always did, that there was a girl still trying to fold her new height into her body, and failing in ways that made the body luminous. The sight made Missandei brave. "If I am to be your hand," she said, "I will begin by asking you to let go of your own." Daenerys made the small sound that in other mouths would be a laugh. It was a tightening sigh. "Which thing?" she said. "Is my hand?" "Meereen," Missandei said. "The great, cruel hand you have been holding so tightly it could not clap for you even when it wished to." Something passed through Daenerys' face like a cloud crossing a hawk. She nodded, slowly, as if the nod belonged to gravity. We will go. She said, we will go to where the sea gathers the tongues. We will go to the free cities and make them understand that what we ask is not mercy, but arithmetic. We will ask them to learn to count new. And if they refuse? Missandei asked. Her voice did not tremble. It was a delicate blade. Then we will show them a dragon is a number 2, Daenerys said without heat. And then she shook her head a fraction. But I am weary of showing. Speak to them first. Speak before we scorch the parchment. Then let your decree be ready by morning, Missandei said, slipping into the pace of work that had saved her life more than once. Name me your hand where everyone can see it, and no one can argue after. Sign with your own blood if it pleases you to make the writing stubborn. Announce a charter. Announce a convocation of cities. Do not ask them to bow. Tell them you are calling them to become what they have said they are. Nendo. What name do we give it? Daenerys asked. Her eyes were a winter seen from summer. They love names. It lets them pretend a thing has shape. Missandei had written many names for the same wind. She thought of Aeneas' soft words. She thought of Marine's full-throated words. She thought of the Braavosi, who liked the hard syllables that would not slip from wet decks. Call it the concord of the narrow and the great. She said, let the sea hear itself. Let the Rhoyne remember her breath. Nando. Daenerys nodded again, and there was a fast glint in her eyes that was not lamp, but decision. 8 morning, she said. When they rose, the robe fell more, and the queen ignored it. And then Missandei bent her head to cover it with a grace that felt like a prayer someone else had already prayed. At dawn, Missandei watched the decree take breath from 1,000 throats. In the shadow of the Great Pyramid, where the Giscari liked to parade their old bricks as arguments, Daenerys stood bareheaded and silver-haired, with the sun finding the streaks where oil had not quite untangled the salt of sleep. The Unsullied were a quiet wall in their winter cloth. The freedmen came in their patched cottons, and their newer linen with the stubborn stains even scrubbing could not teach to leave. The old masters had their jewels, as if they had to remind the light how to fall. Above, on the roofs, the brown girls and boys of Meereen looked like knots in the rope of the sky. Grey Worm read the decree in a hard Meereenese that made the old men's eyes flinch and the young men's shoulders square. Missandei read it again in High Valyrian, letting the vowels carry the weight without breaking. Daario, who had opinions about everything and the smile of a man who kept knives in his jokes, read it in the common tongue they called, in these streets, the road's language. A boy from the fishmongers read it in the slant-nailed syllables of Qohor. A woman who had sewn for a house that had no house anymore read it in a pentoshi that had been made in her mouth by cheap bread and expensive fear. The words were simple, stubborn things. The queen named Missandei of Nath Hand of the Queen. The queen called upon the free cities to meet in neutral water, to consider a compact that would guarantee the peace of trade and the abolition of slavery in all ports that wished their ships welcomed by dragons. The queen pledged protection of merchant fleets from pirates in company with any city that signed. The queen promised to levy a tariff so small that it sounded like a lie told by a beggar with uncalloused hands. The queen promised to break any city that declared human flesh legal tender. A ripple went through the heat. Men who would have liked to spit remembered their lips were being watched and swallowed instead. A freedman nearby began to cry. The old masters did not move, but the strings holding their faces taut grew more visible in the morning light. Missandei watched all and none, as she had learned to watch when the world trained knives on the queen she loved. After, when the courtyards disgorged and took in again the day's work like breath, Missandei climbed to her alcove and packed what she would carry for a long sea. She chose 2 of the lamps, the cedar box of inks, the rolled maps whose weights she knew as one knows a friend's warm hand, the rag for wiping, the shell from the shore of Neath, a braided cord that had once bound her hair when she was smaller, and the bundle of letters from girls who had learned to write their names because she had shown them how, and then would bring her peeled fruit as if fruit were letters too. She left behind the heavy robe a Corthine had given her, that could never quite decide if it was cloth or gold. On the quay, a quick-eating light made the water look like the skin of some serpent deciding whether to be friendly. The city smell was thinner, salted now, and the voice of Marine, which could never quite sing in one key, settled into a humming where gulls stitched sail to sky. Daenerys stood with one dragon neck curled near her shoulder, as if the beast were a scarf that had decided to live. The ship that waited for them was a brave Ossi build, lean and hungry, its prow a woman with hair blown forever by a wind that could not be seen. Tyrion came. He wore Travel's cunning, a brown that would not show spilled wine if he could be persuaded to spill any that was not already in him. His clever face was kinder for once. He did not look at Missandei as a curiosity, but as if he had finally decided that the smallest person in the room was not always himself. He bowed to her. He did it cleanly, not making a joke out of the angle. "I will keep the knives amused in your absence," he said to Daenerys, and then looked to Missandei. "Teach the sea to listen to reason. I have never seen it done." "The sea is full of reason," Missandei said. "It repeats itself until men pretend they have discovered cycles." He smiled, and it fit him. A tight, quick garment that could almost be called handsome. "If you come back with the free cities in your pocket," he said, "I will begin to believe in gods." "If I had gods," Missandei said, and the ship's prow creaked as if it were her thought, "I would ask them to teach men to believe in each other instead." The first days at sea were a lesson in quiet. Missandei had known seas as a child, but the ships of Astapor had been ovens, the men on them shutters that swung in every wind. This ship had a rhythm her body could join without shame. The Braavosi captain, a woman with shoulders made by hauling nets when she was 14 and 10,000 throws, had taught her weariness was just a season the arms could outlast. Liked Missandei the way spinners like a spool that never knots. She brought the hand-sugared lemon peel and a book in which a dead man had listed all known pirates with their scars and their favorite curses, and a violinist who could make the nights come at noon if she wished. Missandei stood often at the bow with Grey Worm, an arm length behind her like a second thought she had decided to keep. She let the spray salt her mouth and thought of contracts as if they were tides. How do you write a promise that can be read in a storm? How do you tell lies that its flower houses could sell art without selling people? And teach Tyrosh to be proud of its dyes instead of its chains? How do you bend the Iron Bank into a coin that could be spent in the street? She remembered each face of each city as a story she had been told, while someone else ate. At night, when the deck creaked and the stars were rubbed bright by the cold, she would lay the shell of En-Eth against her ear and pretend she could hear a specific wave. Grey Worm watched her once and asked, "What do you hear?" "The same sea," she said, "but speaking a word I knew when I was very small." "What word?" "It is a sigh with hands," she said, and he nodded as if he understood, because understanding was his hospitality. Braavos came out of fog like letters appearing as ink burrows into paper. They were answered by a bell. The stone giants holding the harbor had an indifference that was almost a blessing. The Sea Lord's people met them with narrow boats and narrow eyes. A great heron walked the shingle as if it were built to die of patience. The city smelled of fish scales, salt, a sweet wine poured from a high place into a narrow mouth, and the metal used for masked helmets of men who liked to pretend a sword hilt was a person. The meeting was where everyone expected it not to be, in a long house near a canal that did not have a name locals would deign to share. The Sea Lord was not there. That was the custom. One did not present the person who nominally ruled until one was sure there was no flint under the soft bread. Instead, the city sent two men who were so unlike as to be a paired set, one tall as a mast with a face that could have been carved from old oars, one narrow with a mouth made for poisoning and unpoisoning wine. The Iron Bank sent a woman who wore gray and the expression of a ledger book that had just noticed a mistake made last year. Missandei thought of the En-Eathi practice of listening to a man's breathing for the truth he feared, and so welcomed the still. She drank the sweet wine and let it make a warmth that she did not require. On the table lay unrolled a map of the Western Sea, whose ink looked still wet even after a century. The names flowed and hung in the lamplight. Braavos likes promises that grow fatter while they sleep, said the narrow man with the mouth. Promises like sleeping geese, the tall one added, faintly amused by his colleague. We prefer them penned. Your promise, said the Iron Bank's woman, is to break the cost of flesh so thoroughly that markets forget to ask for it. Your tariff for trade is a child's coin. Your offer of protection means a fleet. Your city knows how to move ships like a woman moves hairpins, said Missandei, very gently, and saw the men blink. You also know how often drowned men wash on steps. We know, said the narrow man. We know the sea makes equals and widows. In that silence Missandei laid the first stones of the bridge she had carried all this way without letting it become heavy enough to sink her. Your city hated chains loudly. She said, you broke yours when you were young and clever, and your memory of pain has made you rich. It also made you hard. That hardness is useful. It is less useful when it makes you hear only the sound of your own hammer. Now, the tall man's eyes, which had been far away, returned. The woman from the bank touched her ring, a habit Missandei recognized and trusted. Speak, said the woman. Missandei spoke. She spoke of tariffs that could be reduced further for those cities that took oaths before the gods who liked oaths, and would post the oath in their market squares. She spoke of a free fleet that would contain ships from Bravos in quantity and men from Kohor, to tie their oaths to the black goat, so they could not wiggle free. She spoke of pentos, who would agree to anything that let them complain of it afterward, so long as they could get fat counting their complaints. She spoke of Tyrosh and Mir, two cities whose rivalry could be made into a fabric to wrap laws in. She spoke of Lys, where men with soft hands could be convinced the softness of their hands would be admired more without the stink of chains to set off their perfumes. She spoke of Volantis, and here her voice deepened, because Volantis had blood in their gutters that had been poured with hymns. You cannot break Volantis with Latin letters, said the narrow man. You cannot even break Volantis with dragons. You break Volantis with old gods if you break it at all. I will not break Volantis, Missandei said flatly. I will remind Volantis that their red priests have told them a queen of fire is their future. You love your banks. Others love their prophecies. We can walk between. You will use their faith, the woman said. Not approving, not disapproving. Recording. I will speak to it, Missandei said. I do not use faith. I call it to eat at the table with numbers. The tall man smiled for the first time in a way that became his face. We are fond of tables. Then you will send your ships, Missandei said, and your letters. You will write to Pentos and Myre and Tyrosh, in such courteous words, they need not hear the threat in them. And you will write to Lys in a scented hand that suggests the queen has a sense of humor about luxury, so long as it does not involve buying people. You will allow us the use of your harbor for a convocation in 1 month. Not here, since you are too proud to be so obvious, but at Loreth, where the sea is simpler and the people more romantic, and we can pretend to be dreamers discovering standards. Then? The narrow man laughed. It was a sudden clear sound like a string plucked. Loreth, he said. The city of maps no one can follow. You would make a straight road through their maze. Only for a day, Missandei said. Then they may return to being a delightful confusion. And our price? The woman asked. Because someone had to. Missandei stood, because price lives in the spine. We give you guarantees of repayment for the fleet's provisioning from the Queen's levies in Marine, whose bureaucracy I now hold in my hand, and which will become efficient if I must discipline paper with fire. We give you the right to put 2 of your auditors in our counting house for the term of the agreement, where I will feed them figs and watch their fingertips. We give you the prestige of being first, so you may later claim to have thought of it. Then shall. And if the others do not come, the tall man said, not to shake her but to see how she would settle. Missandei glanced past him at the canal where a boy had decided to float a piece of cork with 3 nails stuck in it for masts. They will come, she said, because Bravos will have come, because the queen will put a dragon in the sky that day, not to frighten, but to make a shadow like a standard. Because 100 small captains with small ships and large mouths will smell opportunity. Because I will write letters in their languages that make the words for profit and honor more intimate with one another than they have been in a century. Because, if nothing else, they will come to be seen refusing politely. The woman studied Missandei until Missandei felt she was a column of figures that might, with one more look, either balance or collapse. Then the woman nodded once, and Missandei let herself exhale a little through her nose, the way Nathi mothers do when their child has finally slept. They sent for ink. The tall man scratched his name with a hand that had cut net ropes. The woman wrote like a river, long and smooth and making deltas where anyone else would have flooded. The narrow man added a flourish that was unnecessary and charming. Missandei wrote as she always wrote, precisely, as if words could slip their chains and run, and she must tie them gently at the ankle. That night, she and Grey Worm walked Bravos in the fog. The streets had some of Marine's hunger and none of its disease. A man with a harp on a bridge sang about the first ship, the one that hid and made a city out of hiding. Grey Worm listened as if learning a march. Missandei watched the way mist kissed bronze and thought, with sudden ferocity of NDE. She had left her island because men dragged her from it. She would return to it one day because a woman with dragons had learned to ask her what she thought. She took Grey Worm's hand, and he lifted their joined hands slightly, as if reporting to himself that this was permissible in this place at this hour. Pentos was easy in the way a man is easy when he owes you, and has not yet remembered that he owes you. The magisters greeted Missandei in the house of the Saffron Yard, where all the pillars were too slim and too tall, because the architect had been punished by being told to build in a way that would embarrass him forever. They smiled as if they were being photographed for the future. Missandei fed them the compliment they required, that their city had always been civilized, even when civilization was unfashionable. She gave them a tariff 2/10 lower than the one she had given to Bravos, which made them feel clever. She added provisions for harbor improvements that would employ men for 6 months. She added a clause about the protection of Pentoshi fishermen during the sardine run that meant more to them than the questions of slavery that made their lips thin. They signed. They drank to their cleverness. In Mir, the Glassblowers Guild tried to measure Missandei's sincerity by the degree to which her skin refused the sweat of their furnace rooms. She stood with them through one whole hour of molten sand becoming lens, while the foreman told a story about a king who had wanted to see his own blood magnified. She left with 3 glass lenses, the promise of a new lighthouse if the Concord protected them from Taroshi raids, and a piece of gossip that said Lys would do whatever Mare did so long as they could sneer differently while doing it. Tyrosh wanted to quarrel. It was their way of agreeing. Their Archon, a man whose beard had been dyed with so many colors it looked like a festival had been buried there, shouted amiably and slapped the table as if applauding wine. Missandei let him shout. When he had tired, she slipped in the words that would make his city great in the songs of 100 docks. Dyes for standards, cloth for new uniforms for those cities that promised never to put them on men whose wrists were shackled. He liked the idea of the world dressed in his colors. He signed with a flourish and kissed Missandei's hand without permission, and then flinched when Grey Worm's presence thickened the air a fraction. Lys was the hardest kindness. In its blue arcs of sea and white houses that looked as if they had been carved from turned milk, Missandei had to say the words no one in that place wanted to hear spoken in the light. She said them as if they were jewels. She said that no man could own another, and that houses devoted to beauty would be more exquisite for it, and that the wealth of Lys came from the same ocean that had always made free its udders, and that it was unseemly to charge the sea interest in blood. The matron of the greatest house of Lys, whose hand had 2 rings that belonged to men who had died in the same year and who had not loved her, listened as if quilting with her eyes. She did not sign that day. She asked Missandei to come to the baths, and in the baths they sat hip to hip and spoke as women have always spoken where steam unknots the throat. The next morning, Lys signed not for love, but for fear of being the last. Volantis waited. Volantis was a river with iron memory. Black walls that remembered the time when fear could make an empire fit in one hand. The Tiger faction wore stripped cloaks with pride swollen into them like bread in a warm room. The The red priests set fire to sentences and fed them to crowds who wanted a god that would taste like victory. Missandei came ashore in sandals instead of shoes and took the hand of an old woman to step across a mud slick. She let herself be small. She let herself be the hand who had come from Enith with butterflies in her blood. She visited the temple and let Benero's eyes rake her as if seeking a shard of prophecy in the flesh of an ordinary girl. She allowed him to speak of light making chains melt like snow. She did not correct him. She went to the fish market and recited a recipe for stew from memory. For a woman whose grandmother had been born in Eth and Eneth and stolen to this city to make such stews. She bought nothing. She left coins for the fish she did not take. With the triarchs she spoke like a scribe. She showed them numbers that did not insult them, so they did not have to pretend anger. She spoke to their idea of themselves as an old fire still warm enough to cook with. She did not ask them to kneel to dragons. She asked them to join a convoy that would keep their ships from being picked like jewelry boxes on a road where the militia had gone home. She put before them letters with 3 seals already drying on them from Bravos and Pentos and Tyrosh. She put before them a letter in the slanted hand of a Volantine trader she had found in Mir, who swore that if Volantis signed, he would be permitted to marry the woman he had loved for 9 months without paying her owner a dowry of 2 human beings. She did not bring the queen into it more than she must. She kept Daenerys hovering at the edge of those rooms like heat you do not see until your mouth goes dry. When the triarchs argued among themselves, Missandei sipped water and looked at the floor as if pitying a stain there. When they asked for time, she gave them the afternoon and no more. When they asked whether a failure to sign would be considered an insult, she made her face gentler than a mother's hands and said, "No, Excellence. It would be considered a confession." She saw them flinch. She rose. All that evening Volantis howled in its various salons. Missandei and Grey Worm walked the longest bridge and watched the red sun ball itself against the river and miss. Volantis did not sign that day. Missandei did not expect them to. She left a letter that included a word Benero would recognize, a word for light that only the old priests used when they were pretending to be humble. She left a second letter with figures so exact that no banker could resist whispering them. She boarded her ship without looking back, because the grace of not looking back can sometimes be a hook lodged in another's pride. Loreth came flower-like out of its own fog. The convocation would be there. Ships arrived like polite arguments, their flags carefully arranged so that no color could be mistaken for disrespect. The harbor officers were overwhelmed and delighted. Men from Norvos, with faces that looked as if beards had once been nailed on and removed with care. Men from Kohor with their goats worked into their armor somehow. Women from Bravos who did not look at water, as if it were theirs. 2 Pentoshi whose belts were too wide. A Mirish lens maker who had hurried and forgotten to remove the silver dust from his hair. A Lysani matron with a retinue of boys who looked in all. Missandei stood on the shore with a scrap of Ennethi cloth knotted around her wrist. In the city's largest hall, a building that had once been a school for an art only Lorathi knew, and now served the world, because the world had better manners when inside it. The tables were a perfect oval. She had insisted on that shape. She did not sit at the top, because she had abolished the idea that there was such a thing as top. She sat between a Taroshi and a Bravosi, and across from the chair left empty for Volantis. The queen did not come inside. She walked the terraces, visible to the harbor, a silver word in the margin of a page that no one would miss, with a dragon slipping between cloud and sunlight to make a shadow like a thought. The first hours were all feast. Loreth had found a fish that tasted of smoke and rain, and had decided the world must taste it. It poured out a clear spirit that knifed the air, and then apologized with slices of pear. Missandei ate enough to demonstrate gratitude, and not enough to demonstrate appetite. She listened to men tell stories that were not stories so much as nets cast over each other to tangle the afternoon. She let the unsaid settle under the table. When she stood, the room did not go hush. It changed its hum to the pitch used for listening to something you might have to repeat later to a person who will not understand it. "I will not speak of dragons," Missandei said, in the language of the road. Then in Pentoshi. Then, because it amused her to tilt the room, in the square tongue of Nenath. I will not speak of queens, or of the way men kneel. I will speak of the sea, and the things we have taken from it, and the things it is beginning to take back. I will speak of pirates who learned to be businessmen because we let them, and of slavers who pretended to be priests because we let them, and of children who do not know the names of the winds, because the men who own their bodies also own their sightlines. Then, Estelle. There were murmurs. She let them rise and fall. She was not afraid of their noise. It was a kind of weather. I am the hand of the queen, she said. I am also a girl of Endiath who learned to bend the world with the exactness of her speech. I ask you to make a concord of the narrow and of the great, because the sea we share is both. You will swear on your gods, on your banks, on your children's foreheads, I do not care which, to make no man merchandise. You will promise harbor to any ship that carries the mark I lay here on this table, because that mark will mean the ship keeps its people as people. You will send ships, 2 from each of your proud ports, to patrol the lanes we are agreeing to. We will levy tariffs as small as the thickness of a nail to pay for this, and the Iron Bank will keep count and dance in its ledgers and be happy for it. Those who do not sign will still be welcome to trade. The sea is not ours to forbid, but they will pay 5 times what you pay, and they will not be escorted, and they had best hope that pirates are in a mood for charity. If you cannot be good, be expensive. Menepshao. She watched the thought enter them like a tide running under the floorboards. The Bravosi nodded to themselves as if checking off a list. The Tyroshi smiled with a merchant's teeth. The Mirish lensmaker peered through one of his own roundings as if she were an object he needed to bring closer. A Norvoshi priest, beard braided with silver bells that did not dare ring out of season, rose and said, "The black goat," and Missandei interrupted him while appearing to yield, telling him exactly what oath ritual the goat preferred in cases of treaty, and how the words would be shaped so that the goat could believe they were genuine, while knowing that men are men and will cheat, and may the goat find that tolerable on holy days. He sat, satisfied and disarmed. The room laughed softly, impressed it had been anticipated. Someone asked about Volantis and whether dragons would be asked to pass there without snarling. Missandei glanced to the empty chair and said, "Volantis is a place where fire is a language. We are writing to them in it even now." She did not say that the letter she had phrased differently, for the red priests, might set the city alight in a way no dragon could manage. It was not necessary to say the obvious. They argued. They told stories about when the sea had been gentler. They made threats that were invitations to make better threats. Missandei answered each as if stacking china, careful and elegant and impossible to find fault with, unless you hated China. The Iron Bank woman spoke once to say the numbers were clean. That helped. Bravos signed first, as promised. Pentos, with relief. Mir signed as if placing an ornament on his own cleverness. Tyrosh signed and then asked loudly if the seal wax came in colors. Norvos signed because there were rules for signing, and he had just been given them. Kohor signed after asking whether the Free Fleet would ever need to dock in their forges, which made no sense, and all the sense in a world where men make myths out of their metal. Lys waited until the last, and then signed with a grimace that said, "We will tell our children we invented this." Volantis's chair remained empty. Like a missing tooth, the tongue keeps prodding. When the dragon passed over the hall at last, it was not a threat. It was a silhouette. It made men look up and remember that the sky can be more than weather. Missandei looked down at the signatures. She allowed herself one breath that was not for anyone else. After, in the small room where steam rose from a copper basin and lemons were cut to make the air awake, Grey Worm came to stand where he always stood, half in and half out of lamplight. He watched her wash the ink from her hands. He said, "Not as a soldier. You made them listen." "I made them talk to the part of themselves that wishes to go on living," she said. Her hands were brown and small. They looked like any girl's hands when wet. "Will it hold?" he asked. "It will hold," she said, and put a towel to her skin. "Until the next wind. We will be there when it shifts." He nodded, slow, as if this were a tactic he could teach his men, to listen to a wind as if it wore shoes. The letters went out as birds yoked to destiny. Missandei wrote late into the night for Volantis. She drafted 2 versions, then a third, and kept the third. She wrote to the Triarchs in the language of law, flat and relentless as rain. She wrote to Benero in an old tongue she had learned as a treat to herself, the way some women learn to play an instrument in secret. She did not ask. She said, "The day has come that your hearth was telling you about." She did not promise a queen. She promised a world that would be worthy of one. When a week later, a Volantine skiff came into Lorath, flying the tiger stripes lowered and the red flame hoisted half, she kept her face very calm. The man who stepped ashore had a look like an ancient dog who has just remembered that he is not unkillable. He said nothing for 3 breaths that he made full of his breath deliberately. Then he spoke and said, "We will come to Bravos to sign. We cannot do it here. Our pride has neighbors. Men are one." Missandei inclined her head. "We will bring the ink," she said, and then did a strange thing that made him blink. She touched her fingers to her lips and then to the empty space beside them, as if she had kissed some invisible thing that had been hovering there. It was an old Ennethi sign, of hailing a spirit one had invited to a meeting. She did it in thanks for how far the world had come without asking her permission first. Night fell slow and agreed to stay. Missandei walked the Lorathi docks and listened to ships invent the future with their ropes. The dragon was a dark mountain, crossing a darker sky. Denris came up beside her without announcement, as she often did, sharing her air. "I heard you made men stop gobbling and begin to chew," the queen said. With a smile Missandei would have tasted if she had been the sort of girl to taste smiles. "They will swallow," Missandei said. "Some will spit later and try not to. Some will pretend they never ate. Some will ask for seconds." "And Volantis?" Denris asked. "Volantis is coming to Bravos," Missandei said. "We will receive them on a bridge where everyone can see how well their feet know the boards." Daenerys breathed out. It sounded like a page turned carefully. She looked not at the sky but at Missandei, and in that look Missandei felt a warmth that made her remember the first time someone had asked her opinion, without intending to punish her for having one. "Hand of mine," the queen said, and did not say thank you, which would have been a lesser coin. "Teach me how to wait between waves, without mistaking stillness for safety." Missandei's lips parted. A laughter that did not have to be heard to be known moved inside her. "You do not have to learn," she said. "You already do that when you breathe." She let her voice soften. "It is the world that must come to your patience. Then we will lend it some," Denris said. And the dragon turned, and the wind changed, and the lanterns of 100 ships answered one another across the water as if letters had learned to live flame. In the days that followed, the city of Lorath found itself acting as clerk to men who did not know how to queue, and who suddenly discovered that patience with a pen could be profitable. Missandei met with ship captains whose faces were a geography of old weather. She taught a scribe from Pentos how to draw the Concord's mark, a simple circle with 2 lines across it, one narrow and one broad, the narrow and the great crossing. She refused bribes that were not even clever, amused by their lack. She accepted gifts that were, as she put it to herself, useful metaphors. A jar of salt from the far north that tasted of iron and fishbone, a dyed ribbon from Tyrosh the exact color of bruised plums, a piece of Kohoric steel worked into a quill that was heavier than a quill should be, and reminded the hand who was boss. She wrote home to Marine long letters about grain. She asked for Tommen to be made sober by promotion. She sent a note to Tyrion with a drawing of a dragon wearing spectacles and the instruction, "Please teach him to read ledgers, or at least to pretend." He sent back something that might have been a dragon trying to look innocent and failing. On the morning, a courier brought word that the pirates of the Stepstones had tried to take a Myrish ship and had been chased away by a Bravosi and a Pentoshi, acting together under the mark. Missandei allowed herself 5 heartbeats of quiet pride. It was not much. It was everything. In the evenings, she walked the shore with Grey Worm. They did not always speak. Once she told him a story from Neth, about a butterfly that fell in love with a flame and learned to be content with its reflection in a pool. He listened without interrupting, then asked, "How one taught contentment to a longing?" She said, "One does not. One teaches it to stand beside longing like a friend who knows when to leave." He took her hand again. His hand was calloused, a language she had learned to hear with her skin. She thought then of children on Anaeth learning the names of the winds, and of girls in Marine practicing their letters so their names would not be stolen again, and of the free cities, which were learning, against their will, to pronounce a word they had forgotten. The world to come had shape. It would try to soften, to slither out of it. That would be later. There would be Volantis on a bridge under a dragon's shadow, and the red priests making thunder with their mouths to cover the sound of old chains breaking again, but quieter this time. There would be pirates deciding that an honest tariff was less trouble to survive than an honest war. There would be men whose faces had never learned to smile, honestly discovering that their sons could do it without first being taught. There would be bargains and betrayals and letters, written in the shade of sails, where ink dried too slow and Missandei had to blow on it like a mother on porridge. That night, she stood on the terrace of the Lorathi Hall and watched the sea change color the way a whispered word changes meaning when it hears itself spoken by a friend. Daenerys was somewhere above her on the rooftop, with the dragon and with herself. Missandei touched the NDE cloth around her wrist and thought, very calmly, that there are hands you are born with and hands you earn, and that the latter could become as faithful as any blood. Behind her, footsteps. Grey Worm, of course. He did not always need to speak. He stood beside her and let the wind flatten his tunic against his chest, as if it wanted to see the exact shape of the man. The air had the taste of lemons someone had sliced in another room, and the scent wandered out to find them. Ships listed softly in their sleep. Somewhere a priest stumbled on his bells and pretended he had meant them to speak. "It is quiet," Grey Worm said, as if reporting. "For now," Missandei said. "Tomorrow, we will teach the quiet to endure." "We will," he said. "For as long as men remember their children before their pride," she said. He nodded. "We will remind them." The sea breathed. The lamps below scattered gold on water as if coins had learned to float. The sky made space for stars, and for the idea that one can build instead of burn. Missandei stood, the ink of her work drying where only she could feel it, and let the night rest its full weight upon her shoulders without forcing her to bow. "Oh, Kay." Dawn in Lorath was a pale argument that grew confident as it was spoken. The city wore mist like a shawl it had forgotten to remove, and the gulls were the only bold punctuation in the sentence of the harbor. Missandei woke before the lamps guttered and lay for a moment listening to the sea organize itself into a thought. In the next chamber, a porter's feet described a pattern across worn boards, and farther off, on the quay, a rope smacked wood and then apologized with a creak. Her body kept ship's hours now without needing to be told. She sat up, and the linen fell from her shoulder, and for an instant, she saw herself as she had been on Anaeth, a girl to whom mornings arrived without needing the permission of men. She took ink while the first light lived only in glass and wrote 3 letters. One to Marine, about tariffs and the way to teach a clerk to love columns more than bribes. One to the Iron Bank's woman, clean and tight as coin, requesting 2 auditors who could count without needing to be admired. And one to Bravos, asking for the use of a bridge that would make the world see itself cross. She sanded the pages and sealed them and pressed into the wax the Concord's mark. A circle bisected by 2 lines, one narrow, one broad, until the sign lived there as simply as breath. Grey Worm's knock was as soft as habit. He came in with steam following him like a standard. He had washed without her having to ask. He wore the sleeved black that let him pass among merchants without making men remember spears. She could always tell where, on his body, his armor used to sit by the way his posture kept it as a memory, as if the armor had not been removed so much as translated. "Good morning," she said. He inclined his head. He did not say the words back, not because he did not believe in morning, but because greetings, for him, had been a luxury learned late. "Messenger came before the bell," he said. "From Volantis." The thread in her chest drew taut. "Read me the handwriting," she said. Grey Worm went to the window where the light was brave enough to help and lifted the ribbon scroll. "Old hand," he said. "Proud hand. Letters that make little hooks at the bottom. Ink that was thick when it was fresh. A statesman," Missandei said. "Or a priest who thinks he is one." She took the scroll. The seal was the tiger's. The words, once freed, were heavy with care. Volantis would come. Not here, where their pride would feel handled by strangers. They would come to Bravos and put their names where Bravosi eyes could count them, and red priests could tell themselves fire had demanded it. "Bravos," Missandei said to the room. The word always seemed to fill corners. "We will go." The passage north was a lesson in the way the sea can speak two thoughts at once. By day, the water was a bright, agreeable clerk. By night, it turned philosopher. Black and deep and remembering too much. Missandei stood often at the bow with Lorathi salt still in her hair. She reviewed promises as if they were knots. She must teach to stay tied. She had written to Tyrosh about dyes for standards, to Meyer about lenses for lighthouse lamps, to Pentos about the sardine run, to Kolhor about the right amount of iron to be paid for a fleet's teeth. Each letter was a payment into a future she would not let bounce. Tyrion had sent a note to meet them in Bravos. He wrote that the queen would keep Marine's dinner guests occupied by serving them dry bread and conversation about roads. He included a sketch done by a lazy hand. A dragon perched on a counting house like a stork. Missandei smiled, briefly, alone with the parchment. Bravos appeared as it always did, like a mind changing itself. The Titan shouldered fog aside with the indifference of a very old judge. The bell's voice came through the mist like metal remembering music. They passed beneath the giant, and Missandei felt her stomach do the small turn. It always did there. Not fear so much as a recognition of scale. To be little is sometimes to see farther. The Sea Lord's men awaited them with faces that gave away nothing, except that they were pleased to be required. The city had agreed to the scholar's span, a bridge, slender and arc-backed with sides high enough to keep men from falling off their own importance. It arched over a canal busy with skiffs, and with the littered sunlight of late morning. The Iron Banks woman received them in a room whose windows held more fog than glass. She wore the same gray as before, and carried the same gaze, a ledger in human shape. "You are punctual," she said. "I like to arrive before regret does," Missandei said. They walked the bridge before the ceremony so the air could learn their pace. A Bravosi street singer with a voice like an oiled hinge trailed them for a dozen steps, and then retired. Recognizing that this procession did not require his song, Grey Worm measured distances with his eyes, the way a mason does with his thumb. Missandei marked where the light would fall, at the hour that would matter. She placed the table, a plain plank on trestles, in the crown of the ark so that men would have to climb a little to reach their own signatures. Volantis came with a bull's patience rather than a tiger's leap. First, 2 skiffs carrying men who looked as if their beards had grown laws in them. Then, a longboat with banners under wraps so that the wind could not make a spectacle of them. Lastly, a narrow vessel with 7 red priests whose eyes were little suns that had not slept. The Triarch in their company wore a cloak of shallow stripes, cunctatorily brilliant, and a ring heavy enough to tire any finger that did not believe in its own strength. He introduced himself without the softness that makes men dangerous. The priest who stood closest to him named himself Poris, not Banero, but a man who walked with the assurance of being known by a greater flame. Missandei made herself small, not in abasement, but in the Nethi way that invites a man to lend you the dignity he wishes to be seen possessing. She greeted the Triarch in formal Volantine, as it had been spoken 3 reigns ago, which made his eyes sharpen. She greeted the priest in the specific cadences used when a sacrificer pronounces salt blessed. She greeted the Volantine boatmen who furled the banners last of all in the quick speech they used at the docks, because boatmen remember courtesy better than magistrates. "The bridge is high," said the Triarch, looking up as if to suspect a trap. "Signing on a peak has a way of preventing the hand from trembling," Missandei said. "And the wind teaches humility." He smiled with a mouth that looked as though it rarely had reason. "Our hands do not tremble," he said. "Our hands have," said the Red Priest gently. "There is no shame in fire that learns." He looked at Missandei and added in the old tongue, "You wrote me a word only the old ones use." I took that seriously. "It was not mine," Missandei said. "I borrowed it and will return it." They climbed. The bridge gave a soft stone sigh under their steps. Braavosi lounged at the ends pretending to be uninterested, while making intricate calculations with their eyes. Somewhere nearby a water clock marked the hour with a trickle that sounded like surreptitious applause. At the crown, Daenerys waited not at the table, but at the edge of the bridge, hair loose, bareheaded, the dragon above her, making a shade that crossed and crossed like thought. She did not speak. The look she wore made the men adjust their belts. The Iron Banks woman cleared her throat as if turning a page. "We have assembled to witness an act of arithmetic," she said. "The numbers have been checked. The tariffs have been set. The penalties for breaking are written here." She touched a sheet at the table. "And they will not be changed by tears. Triarch, will you put your name with the others and make it heavier than pride?" "Men see." The Triarch came forward and stopped to look at the mark. "A circle, 2 cuts," he said, as if dismissing it. "Children draw such things. Children's drawings are the first maps," Missandei said. He took the pen and wrote as if every letter were a coin he was careful not to drop. The Red Priest signed with a flourish and a small, theatrical tremor that could have been piety or performance. A Braavosi magistrate, for the pleasure of it, put his name again beside the city's first, and the Iron Banks woman added her tidy ribbon of approval like a stitch. When it was done, the bridge seemed for a breath lighter. The dragon's shadow passed, a long black caress. Far below, on the canal, a boatman shouted a blessing without choosing a god for it. Missandei let the sounds enter her without moving her face. Grey Worm's shoulder eased a fraction, and in him that was celebration. They did not feast. A feast would have let men begin lying too quickly. They drank small cups of harsh, clear spirit that the Braavosi poured when pretending not to be sentimental. Missandei took a mouthful and felt it burn a track down her throat. Burn away a little fear that she had not acknowledged needed burning. Tyrion arrived as the cups emptied, hatless, brisk, his eyes bright with amusement at having outwitted someone who would remain forever unnamed. "So," he said to Missandei, "you have taught the world to walk across a plank of words. The carpenters will be jealous. Clever men always imagine that their jealousy can build." Missandei said, "This time, perhaps it can." "Perhaps," he said, and gave the Iron Banks woman a bow that respected her capacity for refusing flattery. "When you are finished instructing the free cities on their better natures, the Queen asks whether you might instruct Meereen on its weeds. There is a breed of parchment mold that thrives in damp and folly." "I have already sent remedies," Missandei said. "Fire and figs. The figs are for patience while the fire does its work." They stood together and watched Volantis descend. The Red Priest turned at the foot and made a sign with both hands. Missandei did not know, then smiled at her as if he had given her a puzzle for winter. She inclined her head and gave him the Indy sign that sent unthreatening spirits home, just in case his flames had collected anything that would not find Braavos pleasant. The Concord was a thing now. Things have weight. Their first proof came on water. The Free Fleet was not yet the iron host she had imagined at her table, but it made a picture. 2 Braavosi hulls that could turn like thoughts, a Pantashi with its easy deck gossip, a Tyroshi painted too beautifully for war, and therefore perfect for it, and a Mirish cargo vessel bolted into usefulness with extra timber, and a new tower hung with lenses that made distance short. They flew the mark on their sterns, a circle, and a pair of thoughts. Missandei stood at the rail and felt the sun gather her hair. Grey Worm checked drill with a handful of Unsullied who had come to sea and were learning that a spear point remembers itself, even when it is salted. On the 3rd day, a wind brought warning. A cutter with a ragged sail and a captain who had the kind of hands that cannot forget rope hailed them off the stepstones. He shouted in a language whose consonants were all compromises. "Pirates ahead." A lordling of some shoal who styled himself Lord of the Gull's Jaw. He had teeth hung at his belt, and a boy's idea of poetry. His flag was painted with an eye that wept coins. He had 4 ships, quick and thin and arrogant. The captain on the cutter bit his words to make them hurry. "They take and they take," he called. "And if you do not take their taking, you will end with a hold full of your own shame." Missandei thanked him with a hand sign he understood, and sent him into their shadow. She had the drum beat out a tempo that was not for battle, but for thinking. The Pentoshi captain, used to living long by avoiding heroics, grumbled a little, and then, seeing Grey Worm's eyes, found his courage obedient. The Bravosi grinned as if at last someone had asked them to dance. The Taroshi archers tested their bowstrings. The Mirish lens tower slid in its rail, and then fixed the pirate sails like beetles in a glass book. Missandei did not want to fight. She would have one if arithmetic demanded it, but blood has a way of staining ledger paper. She had an idea. She asked the Bravosi captain to bring them close enough for shouting that would not be dissipated by embarrassment. The pirate lord's flagship, a black bird with a slashed beak, came angling in with an insolence that was almost refreshing. On its prow stood the lord himself, hair braided with shells that had never seen a toothbrush, eyes ringed with the soot of vanity, smile excellent and empty. "You fly a new coin," he called. "My men like new coins." "We are not a purse," Missandei called back. "We are a bridge." He laughed and beat the air with his hands as if applauding her joke. "Then let me walk you," he said, and his ship spread slyly, attempting angles. The Bravosi captain tensed. Grey Worm shifted one foot the way he always did in the heartbeat before violence, his entire body collapsing into a clean idea. Missandei lifted her hand. The Pentoshi slowed a fraction. The wind took a breath. She cupped her mouth and shouted, not in the road's tongue, not in any city's speech, but in a stepstone's patter she had learned from a tanner in Lorith, who had liked to talk when drunk about the way men stole weather. She said the pirate lord's name as his mother had said it when he was small and bleeding from his knees. She told him the year, exact, that his father had traded him to a ship to pay a debt that was mostly pride. She said the name of the cove, where he had hidden with a boy he loved and thought no one had seen. She said the precise cost of his ships, what he had paid in coin, yes, but more, what he had paid in betrayals and nights without sleep. And then she said the cost of losing even one of them today. The pirate lord flinched so honestly that Missandei almost felt pity as a physical softness in her elbows. He shouted something that was neither bravery nor surrender, but the noise pride makes when it discovers someone has drawn its portrait. She did not let him think. "Turn!" she shouted. "Turn, and I will not only let you sail. I will hire you. You will run lanes under the mark. You will stop men like you becoming you. You will be paid, poorly, because we will not make heroes of thieves, but better than you will be paid by the sea when it eats you. I will take one of your ships as surety. I will return it when you've earned your better name, or we can write the worst story of—" Silence is never silence on the water. The pirate's sails burned in the Mirish lens glow. The Bravosi crew rested hands lightly on their lines, the way dancers rest hands at the small of their partner's back. Grey Worm's men were statues with breath. The pirate lord looked at her. He was not as young as his pretenses. He had the good sense to know the season had turned. "One ship," he roared at last. "Not my bird. Your worst ship," Missandei said. "And you will repaint your flag with something that does not embarrass the eye." He laughed, furious and human. He signaled with a rag of cloth. One of his vessels, a scabbed thing with a mast that knew grief, sidled away, cursing in timber, and came to heel like a street dog taught, late, to sit. The rest turned. Not exactly honorably, not exactly elegantly. They turned like men discovering their ankles. Missandei saw the arrogance in their sterns. She would have to teach them to earn their pay. She could do that. Grey Worm came to stand beside her, as if to make sure admiration did not make him imprudent. "You could have killed them," he said. "I may yet," Missandei said, which made him make the face he made when surprised into being pleased. "But perhaps we will learn another arithmetic first." They took the scabbed ship under tow and put aboard 2 unsullied and a Bravosi clerk, who Missandei judged was incapable of being charmed by anything that did not balance its books. She wrote on the spot a letter of marque in a hand so clean even salt could not smudge it. The pirate lord sent a gift with his curse, a jar of pickled lemons from an island where lemons were almost blue. It was the kind of present men give when attempting to learn to be civil without losing their appetite. Word travels faster than sail when the world wishes it. By the time they docked in Mire again for water, the glassblowers had turned the tale into something with mirrors. By the time they rested a night in Pentos, a magister inclined to gather gossip like shells had begun to retell the pirate's conversion, as if it had been his suggestion all along. Missandei did not care. If men needed to see themselves in a story to make it useful, she would lend them the mirror. She answered 100 small needs while a Concord grew its first skin. In Tyrosh, she stood in a dye house under strings of wet cloth that looked like tongues, and approved a blue for the Free Fleet standards that would not offend bravos or lies. In Cahors, she watched a forge mistress, scarred, competent, unafraid of staring, stamped the mark into little plates that could be nailed to a ship's stern. In Pentos, she sat at a long table with fishermen who did not trust letters and drew out on the wood the route they would follow around a shoal where pirates liked to rest. She met a man from Norvos who insisted on reciting the oath to the black goat 3 times so that the goat would not be bored. She let him, because boredom is a form of blasphemy in cities built on ritual. She wrote always, ceaselessly, her hand learning to make the Concord's mark, without thinking the way the body learns to drink when offered water. She sent thick packets to Marine about grain silos and levy schedules, about schools for talman, about hiring freedmen girls with clever fingers to become clerks because clever fingers become clever minds if you feed them paper. She wrote to Denares about the sea's temper and set beside the temper a list of which captains were genuinely courageous and which were only afraid of being seen afraid. At night, when the work fell out of her hands with the ink rag, she walked, sometimes alone, sometimes with Grey Worm at her side, like a sentence that has learned to follow naturally from the last, without the reader noticing. In Bravos she crossed bridges with no names, and stopped to listen to violins bleeding notes into fog. In Mire, she climbed a watchtower, and stood inside the lantern, and watched moths mistake the lens for a god. In Pentos she sat on a low step, and let 2 children show her the game with stones and chalk, known to all docks and to no palaces, and she lost to them on purpose and a little on accident. There were letters from Lais that pretended to misunderstand, and letters from Tyrosh that pretended to have thought of everything first. There were men with knives who thought they could make themselves taller by cutting at her taller shadow. They learned to fear the quiet of the unsullied more than their own courage. There was a woman, Valentine, a red priestess with hair like an oath poorly kept, who asked for a private audience and brought with her a heat that made the air waver. She told Missandei, voice low and scented with the herbs that keep prophecy obedient, that shadows had been seen hurrying in alleys, that men in Volantis who had sold and bought for a lifetime did not like losing a profit that had once seemed inevitable. They would not be loud. They would send little hunger to gnaw at rope. They would try to make the Concord seem expensive. Expensive for whom? Missandei asked. For you, the priestess said and smiled, because she had learned to trust fire but not to stop enjoying smoke. For the queen. For those who stand still long enough to be aimed at. Then we will keep moving, Missandei said, and we will teach the rope to be stronger than their teeth. The priestess made the gesture with her fingers that Missandei had seen Pores make on the bridge, and this time, it looked less like theater. You write letters like flames held in a lamp, she said. Do not let the glass crack. Missandei did not. She added to her letters a new layer of instruction. How to check ropes in the morning for cuts that had been kissed shut by dew. How to keep a man from a deck when he had too much to gain by the ship's sinking. How to ask a question that made the answerer reveal not only what he intended but what he had been instructed to conceal. She sent word to Dario to wink his knives at the right throats on the right nights. and to Tyrion to make sure every public counting house had a low stool for a child who wished to watch so that the numbers would learn to behave in front of honesty. There was a quarrel in Norvus over whether the Concord's mark could be hung in a temple whose walls were reserved for antlers and altars. Missandei traveled overland to settle it, curious to see the city whose bells rang only when the god wished it, and men trembled at the idea of spontaneous music. The temple was a square black thing that looked as if it had been borrowed from a knight and never returned. The high priest argued as if he were being gently bled. Missandei listened until he had exhausted the precise angle of his pride. "Hang it on the outer wall," she said at last. "The goat may keep his inside. Men who walk by will see it. Men who go in will be reminded that gods like obedience more than they care what is obeyed about cloth and rope. If the goat objects, have him send me a letter. I will read it out loud to the dragon and see if Flame can be persuaded to fear antlers." The priest stared and then laughed like a man who had been persuaded that his god would not mind being teased by a foreign girl, if the teasing made new rules settle more comfortably on old shoulders. The mark was hung. The bells did not ring. It was considered a triumph. When Missandei returned to Braavos, the city had a mood like a bookshop after a rain. Hushed, damp, slightly smelling of old glue and new possibility. She went to the scholar's span without meaning to, and put her hand on the stone where the Triarch's signature had set the bridge's balance, a little differently forever. The stone was warmer than the day. She thought of letters traveling and arriving, of captains saluting a mark for which, a season before, they would have spat. The sea has a way of teaching men to take the shortest way between hunger and rest. For once, the shortest way was also the kindest. That evening, she met Daenerys at the quay. The queen had the look she sometimes wore after a day of listening to men tell her the same thing in different tones to test whether tone could change the thing. She leaned her hip against a pile and steadied herself with one hand on its rough surface, as if daring splinters. The dragon lay along the harbor roofline like a thought unwilling to be put to bed. "Tell me you have given me a world that will not break the first time it is asked to carry weight," Daenerys said. No one else could have said it without sounding ungrateful. Daenerys made it sound like a story one tells before the fire while the rain is kind at the windows. "It will bend," Missandei said. "Everything bends. But we have taught it which way to bend, so that when it straightens it throws off the old shape and keeps the one you want." "I want many things," Daenerys said. "So do they," Missandei said. "Right now some of our wants agree with theirs. We will keep that agreement from forgetting itself." "Bam!" Daenerys turned her head and in profile looked younger and older at once, as girls do when they have made themselves into symbols, and then, alone, remember teeth and sleep. "And Westeros?" she asked, and the name arrived with a cough of salt off the water. "The ships are not a poem to be admired on the page. I have shores to climb." "You will climb them," Missandei said, and her certainty was not performance. "When you step from plank to sand, I would have these cities already whispering the name of you into the ears of their captains, so that when you look back there is no need to return." "You would make an exile's road past tense," Daenerys said, and smiled. But there was sorrow in it, as if she had loved her own exile for the honesty it demanded, and was saying farewell to an old enemy that had become an honest companion. They walked the roofline where the dragon had warmed the brick. Missandei spoke of pirates recruited into honesty not by sermons but by schedules, of a Mirish lens that changed a captain's idea of how near danger was, of a Volantine priest who had promised, with an eloquence that would have made a girl swoon, and a banker sneak off to balance a book, to tell his flock that chains were a kind of darkness, not even their god approved of, when it kept the faithful from seeing his fire. "Beware men who make the gods sound like themselves," Daenerys said. "I always do," Missandei said. "But sometimes we can rearrange the furniture in their minds while they are performing." Later, at the inn with the paper-thin walls and the fire that tasted like wet straw, Missandei laid herself on a pallet and felt, at last, the length of the day take up residence in her bones. Grey Worm sat at the foot with his back to the wall, and one knee up, as if unconsciously constructing a rampart. He watched the door with half his attention and the woman with the other half. And if the halves were not equal, neither complained. "Do you miss Nath?" he asked into the dark. "I miss the way the sweet wind woke the butterflies," she said. "There is no wind like that here. There is a kind of pear that smells like it, sometimes, when it is very ripe. I miss thinking that danger was a word told by old women to make children cautious. Old women sometimes save lives," he said. "Yes," she said. "So do men who learn to make their hands quiet." He did not reach for her in the way men have been taught to prove something other than affection. He let the back of his fingers find her ankle beneath the blanket and rest there. A touch so light, it had to be decided upon. She closed her eyes on a breath that was as much a choice as the word yes. Weeks became a net. It collected incidents. A Taroshi ship under the mark sailed into Alizani harbor and was refused a berth by a harbor master who had been owned by a house that did not yet trust the taste of freedom. The captain hoisted no storm but raised his mark higher and waited. The Iron Banks woman wrote 3 letters that made men move with a kind of accuracy only gold can teach. The harbor master was removed to a posting over salt ponds where the sun made mirror shards at noon. His replacement was a woman who kept a ledger of who had signed and who had not, and she made the mark mean a shorter line at the counting house in the afternoon. It did more for the Concord than a sermon. In Kohor, a guildmaster tried to counterfeit the plates with the mark and sell them to captains who wanted escort without oaths. A boy, 12, too thin, too earnest for the world to be trusted with him, saw the counterfeiter's apprentice practice the circle poorly and reported it because he had learned to love circles lately. Grey Worm took 6 men and a clerk, whose faith in quill and wax was almost warlike, and visited the guildmaster at dawn. They left without blood on their boots, and with the man's plates melted and recast into a basin for the temple. Missandei signed a letter to the boy's mother, and had it carried by a runner who would make sure it was read aloud in the yard, so the sound of it could be believed. The Stepstones loved tests. Pirates who had not been at the first conversation decided to attempt their own mathematics and found it expensive. 2 ships were taken and given honest work. One was sunk when it tried to use the mark without the oath. Missandei watched that one go under from a distance at twilight. The sea was a quiet, methodical mouth. She did not look away. Grey Worm did once, to look at her face. He did not try to read it, and then decided he had read it. She was not cruel. She was not merciful. She was accurate. There were nights when the work felt like trying to stop a tide with paper. On one such night, a man came to her in Bravos, shaking and dignified in a way that made the shaking a kind of grace. He had been a slave. He had become a boatman. His brother still labored in chains in Volantis because an owner had calculated that his loss would pain fewer people than his sale would satisfy. The man had no coin to offer, only a face like a petition. Missandei sent a letter to the Triarchs with a copy for the Red Priest in which she did not threaten or beg. She calculated interest. Men who own others often soften when shown how their accounts will look. If they cannot borrow or lend at the very place where the world has decided, it will count. The brother appeared a fortnight later on a narrow boat, with ashes in his hair from a temple ceremony he had not understood. He found his way to the bridge and sat down hard, and cried like a man who had forgotten how. Missandei watched him from a distance. She did not need to go nearer to feel the weight leave him, make the air around him rise. She kept her own counsel. She did not break often. Once, only once, alone at a window in Pentos, where the night made a black mirror of the glass, she pressed her knuckles against her teeth and remembered her mother's wrists, the way bone shows itself when it grows tired. She had done so much with the small bones of her hands. She had this sudden panic that the sea would tire of being reasonable. She stood until the panic was a thing that was not her, and then sat and wrote 3 letters in a row because letters always made her a person she could respect again. There were arguments with Tyrion that were as useful as sharpening stones. He believed in levers. She believed in joints. He wanted to place weight at one end of a thing and make the other end lift. She wanted to find the place where 2 parts can begin to move without cracking. They were both right. Their fights were polite and exhausting. Daenerys listened and chose and slept badly, and when she woke, looked newly carved. News came across water like fish that jump into a boat. Sudden, wet, convincing. From Dorn. A rumor, not yet a letter, that the Martells were watching the Concorde with the expression men wear when they have found a path that takes them where they wish to go, without showing too much of their footprints. From Old Town. Second-hand, but the kind of second-hand that belongs to a man who counts correctly. That maesters argued about whether the mark should be recorded in the White Book of Worst and Best Acts of Men at Sea. From the Iron Islands, raucous, unashamed. That some captains had taken to drawing the Concorde circle on their arms in ink, not as pledge but as ward. A superstition that insulted and pleased Missandei at once. One evening, the sky over Bravos turned the color of cut peaches, and the sea decided to imitate. Missandei stood at the edge of the scholar's span with a basket of lemons the pirate lord had sent at last. Better washed and with a note, clumsy and proud, saying his crew had not taken anyone they could not hire in 2 months. Grey Worm came and held the basket as if it might contain a small bomb. He had spent the day with a captain from Tyrosh teaching a handful of sailors to pull as one, and not like arguments. He smelled of rope and salt, and the kind of sweat that belongs to errands that succeed. "Tell me about Nath," he said, because sometimes he asked deliberately, to give her the gift of hearing her own loves. She told him a small story about a boy who had tried to catch a butterfly with a bowl, and how his mother had scolded him gently, and then shown him how to sit still, so that the butterfly might choose to sit on his shoulder. She described the way the river near her village had a bend where the current slowed, and the water liked to tell secrets to rocks, and how children were taught the words to apologize to fish when taking them from the net. She did not tell him about the men who had come. She did not need to. He knew those words already. He took a lemon from the basket and turned it, as if measuring the weight of a small sun. "I think I would like Nath," he said. "I think Nath would like you," she said. It might have been that winter could not wait to find them. A cold came down one morning from the north like a decision. Bravos took it in with its usual practical misery. Cloaks found, braziers woken, curses reassigned to be relevant to wind. Missandei rode inside a room where her breath made a punctuation of its own. The Iron Banks woman visited with a wool about her shoulders that had been woven to look like a sum. Very warm and very exact. "You have made the small tariffs do a surprising amount of work," the woman said. "I am almost, what is a word you would use? Pleased." "Pleased is a city word," Missandei said. Nath would say soothed. "I have not been soothed since I was 9, the woman said, without self-pity. "But I will allow that I feel less inclined to check a blade in my sleeve when I walk home." It was the highest praise she could offer. Missandei accepted it gravely. They spoke then of winter, and what men do when water hardens. Trade slows not only from cold, but from the excuse cold provides for laziness and theft. Missandei proposed winter lanes kept clear by ships that had been built with northern keels and southern stubbornness. The Iron Banks woman nodded and named a captain who insisted on rubbing tallow into his ropes with his own hands, because tallow and obligation feel alike. Daenerys grew restless, the way hawks do when a wind that is theirs arrives. Westeros was a word like a horizon. She could not help walking in that direction with her eyes. Missandei did not restrain her. She arranged. She wrote to Gulltown about what bribes were not bribes, so much as acknowledgments of competence. She wrote to a woman in White Harbor whose cousin had married a man from the Fingers, and who therefore knew 2 kinds of wind. She wrote to a man at the Shield Islands who had storm-weathered through more winters than most men live. She sent quiet word toward Dragonstone, only a whisper in a mouth in Pentos that had reasons to keep whispers fed, that a queen who understood numbers as well as fire would one day need to put her foot on their stones. It was not all forward motion. There was a night in Myre when someone put poison in a cup, meant for her, and a boy drank it, not to save her but because boys drink what is left when men leave. The boy did not die. He learned for a week what dreams made of iron taste like. Missandei sat with him and told him stories in Enethi about butterflies who tricked cats and cats who tricked rivers. The man who had instructed the cupbearer to be careless was invited to a room with no windows and 2 chairs and an unsullied in each corner. He left that room with his fingers whole and his appetite gone. Sometimes mercy is the more terrifying mathematics. In Volantis, the elephants and tigers snarled at one another across a table, and were surprised to discover they had learned to say the same sentence with different words. Slaving had become too expensive. Benero, a rumor and a voice and a fire seen from a bridge, preached about light-burning chains not because chains were wicked, though he thought them so, but because chains were shadows and shadows make men stumble when they are trying to walk toward a dawn. Missandei read the words on parchment in a Bravosi inn and translated them into 7 other languages on the page to see which one made the sentence honest and which one made it merely pretty. She thought often of her mother's hands. The memory was not always a grief. Sometimes it was a tool she used to measure her own steadiness. She had come, by patience and by the stubbornness of surviving, to a place where she could set the angle of the world's elbow and have it bend where she needed. She did not mistake this for power. It was a kind of housekeeping. The world is a difficult house. It produces dust constantly and lets mice in beneath the door if you stop singing for an hour. She sang. On a morning when the fog could have been walked upon if a man were proud enough to risk drowning, the pirate Lord of the Gull's jaw stepped onto a Bravosi quay wearing a coat that had learned dignity late. He carried under his arm a flag, and when he found Missandei he unrolled it with a flourish and a guarded face. The eye was gone. In its place, a circle with 2 lines, narrow and broad, and within the circle, a small gull with its beak closed, as if the bird were practicing listening. "You are ridiculous," she said, "because laughter has its place in diplomacy." "Ridiculous and paid," he said. "It is a new life." "It is the same life, only less stupid," she said. He tilted his head as if trying a posture she had suggested. "That," he said, "I will learn." There were deaths to count as well as signatures. A Pentoshi captain ran a shoal at dusk, and the ship cracked like a plate on stone. 27 souls went to water, and 8 came back up. Missandei wrote their names carefully from a list, and sent the list to a woman in the counting house, to be read aloud with the day's totals, so the numbers would be ashamed of their clean faces. In Tyrosh, a riot broke the windows of a house that had treated people like perfume bottles. The house had already signed the Concord, and was being very brave. Missandei wrote to the Archon that bravery without intelligence was a childhood disease. She sent suggestions in the language men mistake for orders given by themselves. The sea hardened at its edges. The world turned under them, under her pen, under the dragon's shadow. The Concord held. It lived by being used. Stamps hammered into sterns, marks painted on sailcloth, small markers driven into the wharf posts of a dozen harbors. Children traced it in dust with their toes. Men cursed it when it made them wait, and blessed it when it made them rich. Priests tolerated it because it made people behave in a way gods could approve of, without having to work hard. In the quietest hours, Missandei would sometimes take the shell from an Eth from her cedar box and hold it to her ear. It did not speak the sea truly. It spoke her memory of it. That was enough. Grey Worm would watch her and never ask, and she would thank him by keeping still a little longer than necessary, so he could practice resting. The word Westeros grew teeth in Daenerys' mouth. She would bite down on it and then let it go with a little blood on the edges. The ships began to gather in ways that would make later historians argue about whether intention had existed that early, or whether the sea had invented it later to make the story clean. Missandei sent 1,000 small things ahead of the Queen's foot. Letters to quartermasters about what bribes could be turned into wages. Notes to harbor masters about dragging channels quietly at night. Words to women who own taverns near quays about how to teach men to sing songs that make fighting less inevitable. One twilight, in a narrow lane by a Bravosi canal where the water looked like forged iron cooled too quickly, Missandei was stopped by a girl who could have been her at 8. Too thin, too watchful, too ready to make a bargain with a god who would not keep it. The girl looked at her wrist, where Missandei had tied the strip of Enithi cloth, and said, "My aunt says that if I put that circle on our door, the men will bring fish there first." Missandei crouched so their faces could share air. "If you put the circle on your door," she said, "you are telling men that you are watching them count." Men count better when they are watched. The girl nodded, solemn as salt. Will you show me how to draw it? She asked. Missandei did, guiding the small hand, the circle first, then the narrow line, then the broad. She left the chalk with the girl. She walked away thinking, this is the work, to leave chalk in the right hands. The season turned. The dragon molted a little in the light of a morning that felt like it had been counted already. Ships clustered. The Free Fleet standards lifted in that new blue almost sky, and the mark glowed like a simple truth learned late. Missandei stood between Daenerys and the sea, and felt, without dramatics, without poetry she did not have to earn, the next world shifting its weight from one foot to the other, preparing to take a step that would be recorded as inevitably as a tide. On the day the queen took leave of Braavos to turn her face and her ships toward the land that had been trying to remember it had a queen, the scholar's span filled again. The Iron Banks woman came and did not hide a small satisfaction that smelled to Missandei like warm ink. The Red Priest Pori sent a blessing the way one sends a rare spice, measured, expensive, meant to be noticed. The Pirate Lord brought lemons with fewer apologies clinging to their rinds. Tyrion made a speech that sounded like a joke, and was in fact a list of instructions disguised as wit. Missandei said nothing. She had written all the words she needed. She stood as the dragon's shadow went once, twice, over the water, and then did not come back. The beast had found a current and a direction. Grey Worm looked at her. He did not ask if she would go. He knew she would. Her work had not been to remain. It had been to make a cord the queen could pull and feel the free cities at the other end like beads obedient to a thread. She went to the room where her cedar box waited and put the shell within, and then took it out again and slipped it into the fold of her dress where it could hear her heart. She tied the Endithi cloth tighter at her wrist, as if the island were a person who might need to be reassured that its daughter would not be lost when she walked onto a shore that would try to make her a stranger. At the gangway with the ship's smell of pitch and old salt in her lungs. She paused. There was still a city to teach, perhaps the hardest yet. Not Meereen, not Braavos, not Tyrosh or Myr with their vanities and their quick cleverness. The city was a coastline called by 100 names depending on whose hungry map you consulted. It was a place where promises had collected like debris along a storm-damaged quay. It was a place where men carried in their mouths a story about kings and had taught themselves to love the taste even when it made them sick. It would need a new language to tell itself. She had letters enough for several beginnings. She put her foot on the plank. Behind her, the bridge kept its arch. Ahead, the open water waited with the equanimity of an old merchant counting slow and accurate coins. She thought of children drawing circles on doors with chalk, and of old men letting their fingers learn a new mark, and of pirates repainting flags, and of priests learning to speak of light without forgetting shade, and of a queen who had learned to ask a girl from Enneath, not for translation, but for direction. The ship shifted under her like something that had been asleep and decided, with grace, to wake. She moved with it, light on her feet, her balance not the balance of a dancer, but the balance of a person who has taught the world to accommodate her step, just enough that no one feels pushed, everyone feels invited, and the road becomes a little kinder, not because it has changed, but because it has been named correctly. All day the water kept time. All day the gulls rehearsed landing, and never tired of the simple miracle of doing it. In the evening, Missandei came to the bow and pressed the shell to her ear. The sea spoke the word she had given it months ago on the terrace in Meereen, when a queen with wet hair had asked her to take a hand and become another kind. The word had widened since. It contained trade and oath and courage, and a very small bird painted with its beak closed on a ridiculous flag. It contained, as all true words must, a child tracing a circle on a door, while the sun went down, and a mother remembered a time when doors had been a different kind of thing. Grey Worm stood just behind her, as he always had, as he always would until the world commanded otherwise. She did not turn. She did not need to. She said not to the shell or the sea or the man or the dragon, sending a line of smoke across the sky in front of them, like a sentence promised and not yet spoken. "We will make it across," he answered her in a language they had built together, half silence and half breath. "We will."